Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Instant Deck Tech. So today, we are doing something a little bit different for our Instant Deck Tech. Actually, this is the first time we've ever done this on our Instant Deck Tech. We are going to look at a vintage deck. So this is a deck called Powerless Eldrazi. Recently took Mark Hornung to a second place finish at Eternal Extravaganza 4 in Vintage. And this deck is really unique because, as you can see, it cost $1,097, which is a lot of money. I'm not going to say it isn't, but in Vintage, this is essentially an ultra budget list. If you look at the rest of the top 8 from Eternal Extravaganza, the next cheapest deck was $12,000, and all the rest of the decks are $18,000 to $20,000. And this one is $1,000. So this is 1/20th the price of your typical vintage deck. So if you're looking to get into vintage and play a deck that is powerful enough to finish second place at one of the biggest vintage events of the year, but only costs a fraction of the price of most of the decks in the format, this might be the option for you. So the other thing about this deck that is really crazy is it is essentially a modern deck, the modern deck that was banned in modern, and it is successful in vintage. So you have the fast mana. It might seem weird to start off a deck tech with the lands, but that's really what this deck is all about. You have a total of 11 lands that tap for 2 mana, or produce 2 mana. Ayavugan doesn't actually tap, and Ayavugan can actually produce 3 mana with Urborg, so you play lands that make multiple mana. Then you play lands that can produce colored mana. There is a tiny bit of colored cards, mostly Worldbreaker, in this deck. Cavern of Souls also keeps you from getting hit by counterspells, Force of Wills, which are really popular in Vintage. And then you slam big Eldrazi, just like in Modern, just like in Standard, just like in Legacy. It's good enough for Vintage as well. Thought Knot Seers, Reality Smashers, when you're playing these on turn 2 or turn 3, they're super powerful. You can potentially Endbringer as early as turn 3, start drawing some cards, killing Delver of Secrets and Young Pyromancers, keeping things from attacking Grizzlebrands and Emeralds and so forth. And then you got some Worldbreakers to hit your opponent's lands, destroy whatever artifacts or enchantments might be causing you problems, and there's some powerful ones in Vintage. And then you have the cheaper Eldrazi package. Endless Ones can be played early, can also be huge late in the game. Eldrazi Mimics to get pumped up, gives you those really aggressive starts where you play your Ayavugan into Mimic, and then next turn you play a Thought Knot Seer, smash for a ton of damage, and then a couple of Matter Reshapers. Follow that up by some Disruption. So Chalice of the Void, this one was played in Modern as well. You only get 1 copy in Vintage because it's restricted. And then Null Rod, if you're not a Vintage player, this probably looks weird. Null Rod is essentially Stony Silence on an artifact. So this would be the equivalent of playing 4 main deck Stony Silences in Modern. The thing is, in Vintage, everyone's playing Moxen and all these fast mana artifacts, so Null Rod is actually a legitimate main deck card in some strategies just because of what the Vintage format is like. And then you have a Warping Wail Dismember for removal. Warping Wail can also counter something. Killing something with 1 power or 1 toughness actually kills a lot of threats in Vintage. Like I mentioned, Delver of Secrets is a big card in Vintage. Young Pyromancer sees play in Vintage, so it does kill a lot of things, and you can also counter something. And then you close out the main deck with a package of Crucible of Worlds. Allows you to get lands back from your graveyard, and a ton of lands that can destroy your opponent's lands. Wasteland hits a non-basic. Strip Mine hits any land, but it's restricted. And then Ghost Quarter is actually almost Strip Mine in a lot of matchups in Vintage because people are playing very few basic lands. So after 1 or 2 Ghost Quarters, you're going to have all your opponent's basic lands out of their deck, and you're straight up in Strip Mine mode. So you play these threats, and then you just use your lands in your Crucible to continually tax your opponent's resources, so they can't really do anything. In the sideboard, you have a ton of graveyard hate. Dredge is a big deck that you want to be prepared for, so you have 4 Grafdigger's Cages, 4 Leylines of the Void. Grafdigger's Cage also helps against Oath of Druids, which puts a creature into play from your opponent's library. So powerful hate cards to deal with specific decks. Leyline of Sanctity helps against Storm, keeps you from getting hit by discard potentially. And then Pithing Needle to deal with whatever you want, and 1 more Dismember to take care of opposing creatures. So that is essentially the cheapest, real, powerful, playable deck you can build in Vintage. Powerless Eldrazi. It's called that not because it is lacking in power, but because it's not playing any of the Power 9 cards. So if you are looking for a cheap entryway into Vintage, and maybe even cheaper if you have these cards from Legacy or from Standard or Modern, this might be the deck for you to jump into Vintage and actually have some success. Anyway, that's been our instant deck tech for today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed our breakdown of Powerless Eldrazi, and I will talk to you soon.